for an invalid care allowance, and possibly a little-known extra allowance too. And have you heard the one about the woman who helped her charity's funds out by pickling onions for the bazaar round, and a few years later found herself with a small fortune to administrate? It's with that story we start today, as we turn the spotlight on an organisation that in 7 years of life has become a household word in the caring world, and a source of sheer joy to the people who are helped by it. It's Crossroads, the now national network of teams of paid care attendants who'll step into a family to take over from the carer of a physically disabled person when the caring becomes too much, or it threatens to. The relief may be for an hour or two to allow the carer to have a rare lie-in one morning, maybe get out to the pub for an evening. Or it could be overnight, or for days if it's holiday relief that's called for. This woman, for instance, who was too disabled to sit up from her bed to talk to me, had to rely on constant help from her son, day in and day out, till Brent Crossroads took over some of the caring.
The reason why I needed help is not because I'm an invalid, but because the situation at home made it rather important for me to have someone in at lunchtime and to make my life a little easier. And also you find that you have someone to talk to at the same time. They give you your lunch, whatever, get you out of bed, run a horse, do certain needs I have to have, see to.
What was the situation at home that made it so difficult for you?
Well, because I've got no legs and have very serious rheumatoid arthritis in my hands and body, you find I can't hold things very well, small things. And the situation is so tremendously difficult that I found my life nothing but sadness in the end.
Because you had to keep asking for help all the time?
Yes, there's nothing I can do for myself. Even if I am in a wheelchair, I still have to have help. I get the telephone, the television controls, a nice book, make quite sad and I'm happy, and they leave me happy.
Or there's this woman whose husband, severely handicapped by Parkinson's disease, was a permanent responsibility even when she was away from home, since he was always at risk of falling and being hurt.
If I ever did go out, I had to keep on ringing my husband, how are you, and it was some strain.
Now
yes.
Crossroads has come on the scene. What do they do?
Well, they send this person to sit with him. She's absolutely marvellous. And I feel so content when I go out. I feel as if I'm on holiday.
Two people who are glad of Crossroads. But Pat Osborne, who masterminds the whole operation from the Rugby headquarters, is adamant about one thing. Being glad is fine because it implies that Crossroads is giving the service that's needed. But overwhelming gratitude is another matter. After 7 years of the operation overall, of which the last 4 have been on a national scale, Pat still gets letters from people who couldn't believe there was anyone who'd help them with the caring responsibilities of each day. And that makes Pat angry.
It just is so awful because there's a Charter of Human Rights, for instance, isn't there? And when you think of some of the things in that charter, and then you think of what we're denying some of the families, just the basic human rights. But they shouldn't be grateful for having somebody to go in to wipe their bottom or sit them on a commode or make a meal for them. This is one of the reasons that I try very hard to get this recognised as a statutory authority finance-based scheme rather than volunteers just going in and disabled people having to be grateful and accept it.
And that aspect of Crossroads hasn't changed since its beginning 7 years ago. Much else has. For the scheme began humbly, just in Rugby, on a shoestring. That, by the way, is where the pickled onions and bazaars came in. And with a team that you could best describe as compact.
We had about 6 care attendants then, and we were only helping about 28 families.
Almost 1 to 1.
That's right. And we had £5,000 per annum.
Good heavens.
And if you now think that we're helping approximately 1,000 families per week, that's within 4 years. And each Crossroads scheme is a minimum of about £15,000 per annum. And all the money for all the Crossroads schemes comes from statutory authorities. And everybody keeps telling me it's not the right time to start anything new and there's no money. So we have to prove people wrong, really.
That must have happened very early then, if you've got so much interest in the last few years. Even when it was on a local level, you must have been making your point quite quite forcibly, really.
Locally, we weren't making any point at all, in fact. There was a lot of apathy and a lot of misunderstanding and not very much interest.
So it was an uphill struggle?
It was an uphill struggle, but nationally, this is what was really quite incredible. There's one little local scheme which sort of was always on the point of failure because there was never enough money and we always had to keep having jumble sales and bazaars and things. The Department of Health in central government began to be interested in it. And from then we sort of took off when they gave us a grant to become a national organisation.
But you didn't know that was going to happen in the early years. Did you ever get really dispirited and wonder why on earth you got involved in it?
I don't think I got dispirited at that stage. I think I was asked to run the project for 2 years. And it was a bit like sort of the old mother-in-law joke, you know, she comes for 4 days and ends up staying forever. But I honestly didn't think that pilot project would even last for 2 years.
Because of the money?
Well, because of the money and because there wasn't an awful lot of interest, really. But all of us that were involved in those early stages, sort of we got like a disease, I suppose, and we just began to be very aware of the need, and also became increasingly aware of the need nationally, not just in rugby. And so really it was a case of, I suppose, human nature. The more difficult it got, the more determined we were to make it work and to prove it.
That must have been quite something for you, because up till then your experience had admittedly been in nursing, but not specifically handicap, had it?
That's right.
So it was rather new ground for you?
Yes, it was very new ground as far as my profession goes. And also as far as being a hospital nurse and then coming into the community, which I found quite a traumatic experience. And then, of course, one comes face to face with the very real problems that families are having, not only with caring, but also with their housing problems.
Was it very different from what you'd anticipated?
Yes, it was very, very different. Because I think nurses in hospital and people, unless they nurse or work in the community, really have no idea that in this welfare state and this day and age, that for some people their situations are so appalling.
And that was when the crusading started, was it?
I suppose you could call it crusading, yes, although we don't really look upon it like that, really. It's a sort of a slow process, I suppose, that's just suddenly become a great success.
That great success was the result of one particular event that came into Crossroads history in 1977. And that's when the phenomenal growth rate began. For then, onto the scene came the EEC.
The Department of Employment and Social Affairs of the European Commission granted £100,000 to the United Kingdom, not to Crossroads. And that was for a research project which had to look at housing and caring for disabled people. And Crossroads was the organisation which was chosen as the agency to undertake the research project. Having only been used to working out the housekeeping money and suddenly having to administer £100,000. Yes,
it's a far cry from pickling onions to the local bazaar, isn't it, Teresa?
Marilyn. Yes, it is, Marilyn. But anyway, that project is now finished, and of course it was a huge success because we were asked to take 5 geographical areas, and start 5 Crossroads schemes in conjunction with researching the housing for those areas. And in fact, during those 3 years, 25 Crossroads schemes were started, not 5. So that's where it all got a bit overwhelming.
I would take it then that you're pretty happy about the way things have gone so far. But what about the future? Is this the time to say, OK, Crossroads has reached the absolute ultimate?
No. There's no room for complacency at all. It's still a battle. I mean, again, one hesitates on a programme like this. It is a battle to obtain statutory authority money. And OK, so we can reel off there are 27 Crossroads schemes, but nobody really, unless they've been involved with some of those schemes, can appreciate all the arguing and negotiating and meetings and heartbreak and upsets. I mean, I'm not naturally an argumentative type person, but the longer that I'm involved with Crossroads, and I do have to go on arguing and asking for money for the schemes, that one really does get quite angry. That you do have to actually argue and ask for this sort of help, because well, personally, I think that as a society that we do expect a lot of people who are the relatives. That some of them have to go on for many, many years and years and years with no help at all. And when one starts to argue and to put their case, one is either told, oh, don't be so emotional, or, well, they've never had it so good, or so on. But really the hard part is to go on proving that, and to let the professional people and the people who decide where the money should be spent for them to see that. In any case, it makes good sense because it's keeping people in their own homes where they want to be. I think one of the nice things is that maybe these days I don't have to do quite so much arguing as I used to, because 4 years ago, particularly speaking to professionals, and in my own profession, nursing, to put any emphasis on the relatives needing help was something very strange for them to accept that. But I find these days that is much more acceptable.
And to keep you up to date, the latest step in UK development is that Stockport now has a Crossroads branch, and on the international front, following a visit to the European Commission a couple of weeks ago, Pat has been invited by Holland to discuss with them the prospects for a Dutch Crossroads. If you'd like to take advantage of Crossroads' free backup to the caring family, then Pat Osborne can let you know more, and she can tell you whether there's a Crossroads in your district. Contact details are on this week's fact sheet. And the next voice to be heard here on Sugar is that of Martin Duffy. For in our attempts to promote employment in this International Year of Disabled People, young Martin's been continuing his research into ways to find what jobs there are by calling in at an employment rehabilitation centre, hereafter to be referred to as ERC. It's easier. Martin, tell us more.
Well, basically, Marilyn, the ERC is a link between hospital and work. It's intended to help people get back into their old job or find a new one after a long period away from work. Throughout the United Kingdom, there are 27 special centres run by the Manpower Services Commission. Now, recently, I hopped on a train and went up to West Midlands Centre in Birmingham, and this centre can cope with the needs arising from all types of disabilities, and the courses are specially geared to individual needs. Courses can last anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months.
So how are these individual courses mapped out, Martin?
Well, every client has to spend the first week at an ERC in a workshop which is called the intake section. And here, their initial sort of problems and the future of their course is identified. And whilst I was in Birmingham, I met 56-year-old Sid Emery. Now, he'd been at the centre for just 2 days, and he told me what he hoped the centre would do for him.
I'm hoping that I'll be able to find a job that I can be able to do.
What have you been doing in the past?
Well, originally I was a centre lead turner, but then I had a heart attack and I was unable to follow that line of work.
Have you any idea about what you want to do?
Well, I'd rather find some clerical work or something like that, where I could possibly be able to manage, unless they have something here that they find better.
And I know it's early days, but how are you finding the centre so far?
Well, it's been very interesting up to now. Although I haven't had anything to do with clerical work as such, it's been all hand tools and filing and fitting, more or less. Whether this will come in later, I don't know. They say they have to assess you what they think you'd be able to do best.
Each assessment is monitored closely by an occupational psychologist and a resettlement officer. The occupational psychologist is not someone who will lay you out on a couch and ask you about your dreams, albeit they employment ones, as many people seem to think. His role is to discuss with each client how best they can prepare themselves for work, and if they can't go back to their old job, to advise which type of new job is likely to be the most suitable. The job of a resettlement officer is slightly confusing too. Marion Hill told me that although it's her job to keep in touch with a client's local job centre and to advise on job opportunities and employment matters generally, her job must not be confused with that of a local DRO. I asked her how many disabled people take up employment after completing an ERC course.
Sad to say, very few leave here on Fridays and start work again on Mondays. However, we do have a few success stories, but then again, with the current recession and people disabled, it really makes the job worthwhile when we do have a success story. However, I do rely very closely on the local DROs and hope that they take a lot of note of the assessment that I've made, and also under the guidance of the occupational psychologist and all my other colleagues here.
Do you actually rely on the DROs entirely, or do you go out direct to employers yourself?
No, I don't go out directly to employers. It's finding the time, but it's something that I would like to do. And certainly I think there is a need for this to be done, to really market the people that we've got here.
A slightly gloomy prospect, perhaps. But to a lot of disabled people, attending an ERC means more than just finding a job.
It put me back into the world again, really, because before I was just like shut up in my own little prison, you know. I felt rather embarrassed whenever I'd have an attack, you know, in front of others, and just put me off everybody, so I just kept myself to myself.
Well, it started me getting up early in the morning, because I never used to get up in the morning. I used to leave it till dinner time, and I've never been, you know, embarrassed to speak to anybody, but I speak a lot more now. I never shut up. I'm always naturally, and I've been able to use my hands better because my coordination's come back.
Mark and Janet, just two of many hospital outpatients who attend the Employment Rehabilitation Centre on a part-time daily basis. 19-year-old Mark was left epileptic after brain surgery to remove a blood clot. He came to the ERC with limited schooling and lacking confidence. After 6 weeks at the centre, his educational ability and social behaviour has improved. He's been introduced to a new trade, electronic printed circuitry board assembly, in which he's achieved a high standard of work. Mark's job prospects are good. I was told a local employer is interested in offering him a position as an assembler. Janet is 21 and has hydrocephalus. The centre has greatly improved her independence, and she is now leaving to take up what I am certain will be a full-time job. She's getting married. As unemployment increases, the ERC has to adapt to the needs of its clients. With so many young disabled people out of work, Birmingham has introduced a new feature to employment rehabilitation, a specialised service for disabled youngsters aged 16 to 19, which is run by tutors seconded from the local education authority. Gwen Edwards is one of the tutors.
We supply the life and social skills element of the young person's work preparation course. In this course, we try and prepare the young people for everyday life, which is mainly personality development in one way.
Now, this seems to be a new idea throughout ERCs, and one which is growing. Why is that?
I think because we find that people are leaving schools and haven't been through the experiences necessary to prepare them for everyday life. In a situation when there's such high unemployment, it's important that you do very well at an interview, fill out an application form so that people are going to call you for an interview. So this is something that we concentrate on.
17-year-old Jonathan North suffers from a left-sided spastic hemiplegia. He told me what the course meant to him.
Well, I've learned to meet all different people, like, who've got other handicaps than me, and I think that's helped me a lot.
Do you think the sort of idea of work preparation has been useful for you?
Yes, well, it gets people to know other people and how it's going to be out at work instead of at schools. They don't tell you enough about outside life.
You're actually leaving this week. What are you going to do?
Well, once I've left, I'll probably sign on the dole again.
After a day of talking to people at the centre, I went back to where I started, to the office of Superintendent Mike Green. Now that I'd seen the centre in operation, we sat down over a cup of coffee to compare notes. I made the point that the work emphasis seemed to be very much on the industrial side. He explained that in recent years, the pattern of industry in the West Midlands has radically changed. Traditional engineering methods have been overtaken by events. The present demand is for people to work in the electronics industry, which he believes offers more scope to a disabled person than they could have previously found in the engineering field. Because of this growth industry, the centre is stepping beyond its normal role of rehabilitation and into the realms of training.
This doesn't mean to say that we're negating any TOPS or other course available to clients. On the contrary, we would try and encourage them to go on a specific training course for a specific skill. But what we can do is to improve overall skills, and in some cases we can take them so far down the line at the centre that they can go straight from the rehabilitation centre into employment with the confidence of doing a job that they've previously not tried or considered before.
It's very clear that a lot of people come here not really knowing what they want. Their confidence is certainly boosted tremendously, and their keenness to go out and find a job is boosted. But at the end of a course, in a lot of instances, it seems there isn't a job. So isn't that something of an anticlimax?
It is, and I think that this is reflected in the follow-up reports and inquiries that we make of clients who've left the centre. But what perhaps we can do in these difficult times of employment, especially for handicapped people, is to improve and broaden their scope for employment. When they do come here, they're looking for potential employment on a fairly narrow front, considering their disabilities or their particular problems. We can help them to overcome those particular problems, to help to resolve them in their minds, and also help them to resolve them physically as well as mentally. And if we can broaden their scope of consideration for future employment, improve their particular skills, improve their confidence and motivation, then I think they stand a much better chance of obtaining employment following a course than they certainly did beforehand. And surely handicapped people in an open society do not want charity. They want an element of competition. They want to be given the chance to prove that they can do a good job. The centre is demonstrating to them and to employers who visit us that they can do a good job. And I think that this is fulfilling much of what we would like to see in our present and future society.
And not surprisingly, that's a message we've heard before on sugar. The important bit then, Martin, how do you get on such a course?
Well, the person to contact, first of all, is your DRO, who can advise you on a suitable course. The details on this week's fact sheet.
Yes, I certainly will be there. Now, we began today in caring vein, and it's how we end too. Crossroads may offer one source of help to you in everyday living with handicap. The other side of it is financial help to you and the relative or friend who does the caring. That's where the attendance allowance and the invalid care allowance come in. And with the aid of Pat Rock of the Disablement Income Group, we end today with a reassessment of just what the allowances mean, especially in the light of new regulations introduced this month. Let's start with the invalid care allowance.
The invalid care allowance is payable to somebody who cares for a disabled person in receipt of attendance allowance. And that caring has to take the form of 35 hours of care a week. It's not open to a wife looking after a husband, because the state believes that wife should look after a husband. But it is available to husbands and to other people caring for somebody in receipt of attendance allowance over 35 hours a week.
The implication being that someone who's in receipt of attendance allowance needs that care then, and that this caring person is going to have to suffer financially unless it's compensated for because they couldn't go out to work as much as before.
That's right. It is actually to sort of replace, it's not enough as a salary, but it is to pay partly as compensation towards caring for somebody. And in fact, it does protect your pension rights. You are credited with national insurance contributions.
Right, now that's the invalid care allowance then. The attendance allowance, that's the one that goes to the person who's actually handicapped, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's as simple as that. That's the whole basis, that one goes to the carer and one goes to the person who's disabled.
Yes, you cannot get the invalid care allowance unless the person you're caring for is in receipt of attendance allowance. But you can get an attendance allowance, and the person caring for you, for instance, if you are a husband and your wife's caring for you, she won't get the invalid care allowance, but it won't stop you, actually, the disabled person, receiving the attendance allowance. One's for the carer, like invalid care allowance, and one of the attendance allowance for you needing attention.
Right, so that's the sort of the overall look at what the attendance allowance and the invalid care allowance happens to be. But in the terms of the invalid care allowance, things have changed, have they, or have they? Because new regulations were brought in on the 1st of June.
That's right. The new regulation changed on the 1st of June, whereby friends can now claim for the invalid care allowance if they are giving their disabled friend over 35 hours of care a week.
So it's no longer restricted to relatives then?
No,
would be doing
the eligibility is exactly the same. It's just a question, before friends couldn't claim it, and now friends can.
What are the implications of this, Pat?
Well, they're extremely vast. I mean, a lot of people give other people over 35 hours of care a week. They could be a neighbour, they could be an old family friend and so on. People who come in and give assistance. They don't live in, but they give a lot of assistance over a period of time. And if this comes up to 35 hours a week, and often when you total it does, they are now able to claim the invalid care allowance. This is very important perhaps for elderly people, or people who are living on a low income themselves and are helping somebody else out. A lot of voluntary people and friends, really. I think it could also apply to very often disabled people help other disabled people, and it may be that. So it's the widest implication of friends, and I think as many people as possible who think they'd be eligible for this ought to apply as soon as possible.
Now, if you are a friend, not a relative, and you happen to be living with a person who's handicapped, there's something else you should know about, because there could be another source of help in such situations.
It is possible to claim what they call a domestic assistance allowance. If a person is disabled and they have other sort of co-tenants, but they're not just people sharing a house, but they're actually non-dependents and non-relatives, and they're actually caring for you in the sense they are carers. It is possible, if you are on supplementary benefit, that's the disabled person's on supplementary benefit, and you have the tenant's allowance and you need assistance, that you can get the DHSS to give you a domestic assistance allowance. For example, there was a case where a young man in receipt of attendance allowance was paying his carer the lower rate of attendance allowance, $14.45 a week at the moment. The DHSS thought that the person ought to pay rent, and the disabled person said, well, no, because he's my carer. And it was found that because this person was caring for him, because he was disabled, the DHSS could match the amount that the disabled person was giving him. So in this case, the disabled person gave $14.45 a week to the carer, and the DHSS had to give also $14.45 to that person. So, in fact, whereas this was not actually known to be in practice before, it now is. So, in fact, if you're disabled and you have somebody living in a house with you, and they are caring for you, and they're not a relative, and they're not a dependent, but they're sort of like a co-tenant, it may be possible, if you're on supplementary benefit, that you can claim a domestic assistance allowance for them.
And on today's fact sheet you'll find a summary of those details and the addresses of the Disability Alliance and the Disablement Income Group.